Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming here on a Monday afternoon, and thank you very much to Dr. Tim Waring for coming in and giving what sounds like it's going to be a fascinating talk for us. So I'm stepping in for Jürgen Wren here to give an introduction, so my apologies if I read a little bit, but so Dr. Tim Waring is an associate professor of applied cultural evolution at the University of Maine. He studies how culture and cooperation determine human social and environmental outcomes and drive human evolution. Waring's work spans from theory development and empirical research to applied science, covering all scales and time periods, which is great for this institute, from single organizations to the planetary longevity of Homo sapiens. Waring builds evolutionary models of social and cultural change to learn how beneficial behaviors and institutions arise and persist, and test theoretical predictions of human behavior with behavioral and social learning experiments. His evolutionary theory of the environmental sustainability of human systems has been applied to case studies around the world. Dr. Waring has been a pioneer in the development of an applied science of cultural evolution for sustainability and beneficial social change, and leads a global applied research network on the topic. So I can't think of a better talk to be situated within this expanding Institute of Geoanthropology, and I will hand the floor over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good enough. Thank you, Patrick. Sorry, that was the most self-aggrandizing piece of text I've ever written. My apologies. I'm just a regular person. I don't do everything always. Thank you very much for having me. I hope this talk is as crazy to you and feels as exciting and insane as it does to try to give it. But I am going to try to tackle all of what's on that slide there. And of course, a talk like this starts generally with the motivation of human anthropogenic impacts on the environment, right? That does very much motivate me personally in terms of why I try to work on environmental problems. And I will just suffice it to say that I think we have a problem, and we can talk more about those problems in detail. But the environmental problems we face are global, and I think they are pressing. However, that's the motivation, and it's not how I want to start the talk. Instead, I'd like to start the talk with the perspective. And the perspective is this one. I think this is an appropriate perspective, right? We're humans, and we think we know what being human is, right? It's meeting people and, chatting and maybe going to lunch or getting in a train or, sitting around a table, mammal to mammal interactions. But from a distance, from space at night, we look like a glowing slime mold, right? And it's kind of a joke, actually. And here's the thing, I mean it not like a joke, right? We do look like a glowing slime mold. And it's not just I'm going to say that we look like a glowing slime, but I'm going to say it's sort of like we are that alien species, right? So the perspective I want you to take here is of the alien biologist who sees this, arrives at a new planet and sees this and says, whoa, something weird is going on here. We are that weird alien species, okay? And it's clear that we are unique. We're unique in the history of the biosphere. We have this global distribution, tremendous diversity. We've been hyper-invasive, right? And we've seen this absolutely exponential rise. And so we have this question that I think we need to answer. We need to know who we are. What are we, really? How did we get here, right? How did this expansion happen? And how is it going now? And where is it likely to go? These are really important questions. But I think the key point of this perspective is that humans are strange and we require some kind of special explanation, which is to say, we need a good human story. So what is the human story? Well, this is one version of the human story. Humans are the best, right? We've done so many amazing things. Look, we make rockets and we go to the moon. We may go to Mars. Anyone who suggests otherwise is probably trying to stop us from being great. Right? This is an important story, especially where I come from. And there are other stories as well. And I think there are aspects of this, greatness, which are obviously true to some degree. There's another story as well, right? Which in a certain sense is the opposite, right? Which is and it's sort of that, well, a lot of the things that we might consider progress are actually failures in disguise, right? Life on Earth is dying and it's our fault. Obviously, I'm here in part because some of this is true as well. And so, but I think part of the challenge here that plays out in regular society is that these two narratives are opposed to each other. And I think, in fact, we have a much more complicated story that we need to tell that involves aspects of both of these. It needs to be scientific. And of course, we do have scientific stories of where humans are today as well. For example, the Anthropocene has been a nice human story. It's one that has recently been rejected as an epoch, which I think is great. It shows, actually, the Anthropocene story shows that scientists were excited to have a tool, a term, and a little bit of a story that allows them to explain what's going on to society as a whole, and even focus their own research. Of course, I'm not worried that the Anthropocene is going away. The worry is rather not that the Anthropocene doesn't work. It's rather that the Anthropocene might just be an event rather than an epoch, that we may be short-lived. So I would like this human story to be scientific as well. And so I would like it not only to answer these questions, but to answer these questions in terms of the nature of human change over time. We need to understand who we are. That's the question of human uniqueness, right? We also need to understand sort of how we got here, how it's going, and what's next, right, in a way. So the in, of, and beyond dimensions. That's the story of the trajectory of our species. And we want to try to be able to do this in a way that is scientific, that is rigorous enough that we can use it to address these global challenges, right? So that's why, and that's also part of my goal here, is to help us build an applied science of human change. And you'll see I'm about to do a little bit of a pivot. Why an applied science? Well, modern ecological crises constitute an evolutionarily novel event, not just for our species, and I'll talk more about that later, but for the planet. But in addition, those same crises are the unequivocal result of human social and technological evolution. And therefore, there should be something useful that we can do by understanding the nature of that evolutionary change to help address these crises. Now, the first question should be, well, why aren't the sciences of human change that we have now sufficient? I'm not going to spend a lot of your time on this, but I will offer you the quip that I think the lack of theorizing in economics and indiscriminate theorizing in psychology, to pick on a few, don't explain really key features of what's going on with our species, period, right? These include our exponential rise, the way we restructure the biosphere. They include the way we keep trying and failing at managing resources well. They include understanding and predicting our behavior, which is embarrassing if you're a behavioral science, right? So, I mean, I just want to propose that policy based on theories that have these challenges are going to underperform at solving these global level challenges. And I think that's really important. And that's why this perspective, this alien biologist perspective, is useful. Of course, we have sustainability science, which was invented to address these problems, right? Invented to focus on the application and start solving problems first. And this has been fine so far as it goes, but there's a noted lack of generalizability in theory. So I will add now to the story that we need, the theory that we need to explain human uniqueness in my list of ideal goals. We also need to understand and explain the human trajectory. We need to be able to put it in context with the natural environment, and we need to make it scientific. And finally, we need to make it applicable. We need to be able to use it to ensure sort of sustainability or long-term resilience of our systems. So I'm going to give 2 talks today, and I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. And the first will be about building a useful theory. And the second will be sketching an applied science from that same theory. So to begin, let's just talk about building a theory of human evolution that applies to all of these challenges that really we can use to wrestle with the whole thing. This is hard, but we can start with simple set of straw men, right? There have been theories about what has made humans unique over time. Here, an example of some early, trait-based theories: tool making, war making, food sharing, cooking food. All of these things are very useful and a part of human uniqueness. However, they don't really sort of hold up as sort of explanatory theories, right? They don't really give us an explanation of what human uniqueness is. They rather sort of describe a part of it. They certainly don't give us much of a trajectory, and they don't give us predictions that we can use to design interventions from. Let's take another step. We'll move into the 70s and the invention of sociobiology by Ed Wilson. Sociobiology was very controversial. It's simply the idea that we could understand human behavior like we understand the behavior of other organisms using evolutionary principles, perhaps acting on genes. And it spawned a whole bunch of human evolutionary sciences here, 4 of them. They've been largely been successful with the exception of mimetics. And I, as you know, am trained in cultural evolution, so that's what I'll be giving you today. An important theory within cultural evolution is dual inheritance theory. Dual inheritance theory simply proposes that humans have 2, parallel-ish mechanisms of adaptive information transmission, the inheritance of genes and the inheritance of culture. And these 2 inheritance mechanisms are not just important, each carrying their own adaptations, but also they are different and they interact. And we will come back to dual inheritance theory in a moment, but this starts to give us a lot more complexity to work with. Now, these, over the course of, I would say, the last 20 to 30 years, what has emerged, I think, is something of a social synthesis for human evolution that goes beyond those trait-based theories to say that cooperation and cultural evolution together, cultural inheritance, have really defined human uniqueness, really sort of given us the preliminary tools that allow us to fashion custom-made tools in new environments when we arrive in them at the time, and to do so at scale and share the work among a group. So this combination of cooperation and culture is powerful and, importantly, leads to new evolutionary mechanisms, right? Beyond just the evolution of cultural systems or technology, we can think about the co-evolution of genes and culture, or the group level effects on cultural change through cultural group selection. Together, these kinds of mechanisms are believed to have helped our species conquer the planet, right? So when we moved, human ancestors and modern human ancestors spread from Africa over the last 70,000 years, the way in which we adapted to new environments is not genetically. There is some genetic adaptation. Largely, the way in which we adapted is by learning the ecology, figuring out which organisms are good to eat and which should be avoided, and finding new tools and methods of survival and shelter and the rest, creating new life ways. Okay, here we go. Now I'm back. Hello again, everyone. Apologies. I'm going to share that screen again and get back to it. Thank you. Yes. Yes, please. That's great.
Okay, they say it stopped at creating new life ways.
Wonderful. Yes, so we create new life ways to live in different parts of the environment. I'm sorry for people online. It's always worse to be online than to be in person, and I can't tailor everything to you, so I hope it keeps working. So the idea is the social synthesis gives us some more leverage, right? Gives us a theory that allows us to explain more parts of this unique species that we're studying. And it begins to help us understand what it is that we are doing to social ecological systems in the emergence of the Anthropocene. But we still, of course, very much need to develop predictions so that we can understand changes in humanity well enough in order to be able to influence them for the positive. So I'm going to add more to our growing list of desiderata for our theory. We need not only to have it be scientific and applicable. In order for it to be applicable, we need to be able to design interventions. So it has to be based on some predictive capacity of the theory. So if that's enough for your theories, I hope that's enough for me. So let's take a little break here and switch gears and talk about eusocial insects, because it's fun. Eusocial insects are a wonderful example, and this example here is a picture from East African termites. These are powerful organisms. They really modify the environment when they are present. They live in city-states. They have a reliance on agriculture. They have full-time complex division of labor. They have novel modes of information sharing in comparison to other relatives. And they have self-sacrifice for collective defense and reproductive specialization at the level of the group. These, these superorganisms that eusocial insects represent are very fascinating, right? Anyone who has studied them, I'm sure, has this sense of absolute wonder, right? The same kind of alien biology wonder that we have when we're looking at ourselves. And so eusociality and multicellularity and even eukaryotic endosymbiosis, I threw that on just now, can be described as an evolutionary transition in individuality, where an ancestral species is sort of a free-living individual species, which then forms cooperative groups, and those groups then gain control of aspects of their environment, being able to share resources, and over time, as the outcomes that impact the group impact everyone, the interests essentially and features of individuals that benefit the group tend to emerge and become stronger and stronger until over evolutionary time, at the end, you end up with a novel species made out of what used to be subsidiary individuals and is no longer. So this is how we understand multicellularity as well as eusocial insects. Here. This framework has been applied to humans almost since the beginning of its framework by Maynard Smith and Zutmery in 1995. And people have been asking the same question, right? Are humans undergoing an evolutionary transition in individuality? It's a serious question by serious biologists, right? Look, we live in city-states. We have a very heavy reliance on agriculture. We have an unbelievably complex division of labor that's full-time. We share information like nobody's business. And we have, armies, self-sacrifice for collective defense. The only thing on that list we don't have is reproductive specialization. And so this is a legitimate question to ask, and I'm going to take it very seriously. After a pause in the 2000s, research on this question has started to pick up a lot. This is a wonderful graphic from my colleague Yochai Carmel and his workshop on the topic. But biologists and anthropologists have disagreed about how to approach this question of whether humans are undergoing a long-term evolutionary transition. The biologists have said, well, first of all, no, that's not applicable for a bunch of reasons. Secondly, maybe, but yeah, it's incomplete or it's stalled out, and certainly it's not going to work. It's not going to work because human genes are becoming increasingly well mixed on the planet over time, right, in all populations. And so the way it works for this to work is you need to have your genes become different in groups, right? You need group differentiation. Whereas the social scientists have said that going long before Boyd and Richardson's '99 paper, social scientists have been fascinated with this idea that society is some kind of super organic entity. 99, Boyd and Richardson say it's a crude superorganism. Others have said, yeah, look, there is some kind of process which does what you were talking about in genes, and it's happening in culture. It happened when we went from tribes to city-states. It happened during agriculture, perhaps language or institutions. We build new levels of social organization all the time. That's what we're talking about. Yes, it's happening. And the problem is these two are sort of seeing past each other, right? It's sort of like on the one hand, the biologists are saying, yes, a genetic evolutionary transition in individuality is just not going to happen, whereas the anthropologists and social scientists are saying, no, it is happening, and it's happening in culture. And so the question then is, well, you know, the literature just seems really confused, for good reason. This is a confusing situation. So we're going to take this seriously today, and I'm going to catch you up on some of the recent work. We need to take both types of inheritance seriously, both culture and genes. We need to account for the explosive changes in human society and population. And we need to acknowledge complex societies as well as organismal fitness. So coming back now to dual inheritance theory. Dual inheritance theory makes three core claims. And the first is that the capacity to have culture itself is an adaptation, right? The ability to inherit adaptive information from people so that you can then do well in the world is itself a fantastic adaptation, right? And the second one is that culture evolves. Over time, culture can develop and accumulate those adaptations in technology and lifeways and know-how. And then, of course, the third is that genes and culture co-evolve, and we'll dive into that more in a minute. But what is left out here is this question of, well, what should we expect happens with a species that evolves in 2 dimensions, right? That's weird, right? That's weird. Imagine you go to an alien planet and you see a species and you're like, that's weird, it's evolving in 2 dimensions. What does that mean? And they go back to the ship and they do their fancy, Star Trek calculations, right? That's what we've got, right? And here's the thing. People struggle to understand what to do with that, right? Lumsden and Wilson say that genetic natural selection operates in such a way to keep culture on a leash. And when I read that, I was like, oh, are you kidding me? Do you study the same species that I do? I mean, look at us. That's just not how it goes. Human cultural evolution is cumulative. It's likely faster than genes. The only estimates that we really have suggest that it's faster and more adaptive than genes in a number of ways. And as I've argued already, probably a primary mode of adaptation in the last 50,000 years. Certainly our lifetimes, right? So if anything, it's the other way around, right? Yeah, if there's a leash, culture is dragging genes right off the trail, okay? And if that's happening, then we need to think about a different type of evolutionary transition, an evolutionary transition from genetics to culture, right? Of where we store our adaptive reservoir, right? And the idea is not that that we, pull our adaptations out of genes and put them in culture, right? But rather that we grow a lot of amazing adaptations in culture. And where the total most important sum of adaptations resides can be thought of in a dual inheritance system. And perhaps we're undergoing a shift, right? A long-term evolutionary transition in inheritance. If that is the case, which I put to you, is the case, then we need to think really carefully and also study carefully the nature of the cultural inheritance system to which we are migrating. Okay. And as will surprise you not now, culture is significantly more group structured than genes. There are a number of studies here, and some of the best stuff actually involves genetic data. This comparison involves genetic data as well. Ask me later if you want to hear more about those. But human culture not only is more group structured, but group selection on culture seems to be everywhere and can drive human cooperation, right? When groups compete, when teams on a sports field compete, they cooperate within the team better than they would if they didn't have someone to play against, right? So the human cultural inheritance system exhibits strong group structure on its own, which of course is not a surprise, right? Because that's part of how we came to dominate the planet, right? By being able to surround the animal we're trying to collectively hunt, by being able to divide up the labor to do agriculture, right? That's where the adaptive advantage comes in a way. So we can combine these two to give ourselves a very useful system, right? The adaptive capacity of culture on the one hand may be leading to a transition in inheritance, but it also is deeply connected to the group structured nature of culture itself, which of course creates a positive feedback loop as effective groups are able to enhance their ability to find new solutions even faster as they grow. But in addition, that increasing group structure could be leading to a transition in individuality back to where, back as I started with. So together, these two things could form a coupled evolutionary transition from genetic individuals to cultural groups. And this is what I call the evolutionary transition in inheritance and individuality hypothesis. And you can read more about it here. So how would this thing unfold, this crazy two-dimensional evolutionary transition? Quite simply, diagonally, right? It's not that we're becoming superorganisms. It's not like we're going to be cells in some big body, right? And it's also not that we're going to be communicating our most important adaptive information by genes, right? We're already doing that, and it gets transferred by these things, right? That's why we invented them, so that it comes to us faster, right? So I pointed at my cell phone for people online. And the way, of course, in which we do it is gene culture coevolution. So let's take a look at what some of the arguments and evidence would be about gene culture coevolution. And before we do that, let's take a peek at how this might unfold, again, over millions of years. We're talking about a very long-term process, right? Before the transition, we look at human ancestors as being sort of genetic individuals with the phenotype in the environment. And then after the transition, we think of these cultural superorganisms. You can just say society if you want to be comfortable. If you want to be uncomfortable and weird, you say cultural superorganisms. and what that thing is, we don't know because it's not our species, right? This is a species that comes after us. There's millions of years in here. So, of course, first you have the rise of cultural capacity. That's the dual inheritance phase one. Then you have this period where genes and culture are roughly equally adaptive. They both contribute a good amount to human adaptation and survival, but they're about the same strength. And then, of course, finally, cultural evolution overtakes genetic evolution, of course, because some kind of transition has to happen in this theory. So let's take a look at the way this lines up with patterns in genes and culture. The most famous example of gene culture coevolution is the example of lactase persistence in dairying. How many of you have seen or heard of this? Yeah, okay, great. I thought that was okay. Certainly. So this is the very well it's the best evidenced story of gene culture coevolution we have, and it simply has isolated that two traits have undergone a positive feedback system, and they originated somewhere in Northern Europe, something about, I think it was 20,000-ish years ago, with the co-occurrence of being able to keep cattle and drink their milk, and also the adult gene for being able to digest lactose. Of course, this gene we have as babies, but it goes away, and so the wild type is that. So you need to have this adult lactase expression gene. This is a wonderful example, and there have been many others that have been proposed and hypothesized, a lot of extant evidence out there. Of course, there's lots more to be done. But for example, things like food cooking and our shortened and simplified digestive system, our sort of docility on one hand and our cooperative social organization on the other. There are a bunch of things that are believed to perhaps help us maintain and produce and store or transmit beneficial cultural traits, obviously brain size and linguistic ability, but also menopause and having long life history. So this is useful. Let's now go about categorizing it and placing it in places. And before we go on from the gene, from the story of lactose, let's take a look at what's happening today. Right? This is not the story of 20,000 years ago. Those animals are inside a machine, right? Now, outside of the animal welfare implications of this picture, this is amazing, right? It's very different from what we think about when we think about that example of gene culture coevolution. It's highly complex technological system embedded in this huge scale of production, right, within some kind of system of trade. So how do we understand that within the context of the coevolution of genes and culture? Quite simply, the practices of dairying and dairy consumption have spread far beyond the gene. In Japan, where these pictures of milk come from, almost no one is lactose tolerant as an adult, and yet they drink milk. It's not that they don't gain any nutritional benefit from it, but they exhale extra hydrogen. And so here we have it. We're producing a whole bunch of extra milk in a place where the gene isn't. And as if that wasn't enough, my wife can't digest lactose either, but she can buy, soy milk and lactose-free milk. Those should give you a picture of kind of a version of gene culture coevolution, or rather gene culture not coevolution, right? And that's going to become important because if we break these types of examples into categories, we can look at the lactase case as being this case where we have one trait on each side and they sort of spread together. We can also think about the genetic traits that underwrite human sociality generally. These are species typical traits like social cognition, our linguistic abilities, our ability to cooperate with each other. These, emerged early on in human evolution and were limited by the genes to do those things. And when those traits emerge, they influence the entire cultural inheritance system, right? They give us the ability to have language. They give us the ability to work in groups. And so this is a very strong one-way interaction. Naturally, though, we can also think about the reverse, right? Situations where we have a cultural trait that influences the entire genetic inheritance system. And so here, this is what we call cultural preemption as a category for these. And it's the reverse. So we can imagine, for example, group level cultural traits like scientific medicine, which is designed specifically to allow us to dodge natural selection, right? The whole point is to keep people alive, and reproductive medicine being, the most important example of this in a way, right? Allow us, if we can't reproduce, there are things we can do to help us do this. And so this is an example of culture being able to solve some kind of adaptive problem before natural selection gets a chance. And finally, we can break these down into our stages. I just sort of recategorize these here into the stage 1 and stage 2, gene limited and trait pair. And then we will also take a look at this cultural preemption list and just pick out one. Here we have modern agriculture creates surplus calories, leading to unbalanced diets or nutrient deficiencies or obesity. And this, of course, is a challenge for human health, right? Now, in the world where genetic and cultural evolution were both happening at the same time, we might expect some genetic evolution to take place as a result of the fact that we've created a situation where we have more health impacting diseases. And I'm sure to some degree it is. However, what we also see is the emergence of new life ways, right? So now we exercise. Now we try special diets. We have special nutrient supplements. We have an industrial food system. We have regulation to change the distribution of what kinds of foods people eat to encourage them to be healthy. We have pills like Ozempic, which is this pill that is in the United States right now that I think all of the people in LA are taking so that they can eat a lot and avoid being fat. Something like this, right? So these, what are these? These are solutions, culturally evolved solutions to the problem created by another challenge, which itself was created by our very successful cultural system that produced a lot of excess calories. The rest of this list is like this as well, and you can read it in the preprint. So we can align these up here, first of all, and we can also say that we do see evidence of these, and indeed, I think, some evidence of cultural preemption. And I'm happy to go through the list. So if we were to say, well, where are we then in this, millions of years process? We're probably in stage 3. That's kind of crazy, right? Maybe we're at the beginning of it, but wow. Okay, so guess what? Here's what's cool. If you make a theory about the entirety of the evolution of a species that goes all the way to the end of the species, you can make predictions, right? So here they are. Here they are. We can make them in 2 dimensions, inheritance and individuality. Right? We can expect over the long term, if this hypothesis is correct, that the relative importance of cultural inheritance will continue to grow over genetic inheritance. And similarly, the importance of groups in determining individual life outcomes and fitness should continue to increase in the long term. One way to think about this right now, even like right now, is what matters more to the life outcomes of someone, the genes that you were born with or the country you were born into? I mean, wow, right? And so there are more predictions like this in the paper, but these are the 2 core ones. Okay. Whoa, that's exciting. So now let's take this ETII hypothesis and we say, yeah, we get some predictions, right? We get something that is useful. We can explain human uniqueness and the evolution of the Anthropocene. And we have some kind of predictions, and so we need to start, I think we need to start trying to understand what we have here to try to start solving problems. Can we use this to think about human environmental change? There's a whole research agenda that I'm trying to work on with regards to understanding this, the implications of this theory. One of the key things is building a model of this process, and that's ongoing. Testing these predictions with historical as well as contemporary data. Does it have any internal validity whatsoever? There are a lot of questions we can ask, and a lot of work to be done. So that's the end of this new human story that is designed to wrap all the way around the whole thing. And we could stop right there and that would be great. We can have an excellent conversation. But now I'm going to try to do a whole second talk on applying cultural evolution, for beneficial social change, specifically environmental. Okay. And before I go any further, it's absolutely required that the very first thing we address is ethics, because we live in this world right now. This is the Russian invasion. This is one strong, powerful group coming into another group and potentially destroying it, right, with the intent to destroy it. Certainly destroy its institutions, obviously destroy lots of people. So that's relevant because we just charted this whole theory of human evolution that has to do with groups. And so if you're not feeling uncomfortable now, trust me, I am. That's why I put this slide up here. And here's the thing. We have to deal with ethics because, of course, evolution does not connote progress, right? Movement along some sort of theoretical trajectory is not, should not be thought of as some sort of teleological, process. There's no value ranking of societies, and people might want, in societies, might want to occupy different positions along all sorts of dimensions, including this. Now, look, warfare has played a role in human evolution, and not only that, it creates a form of cultural group selection, but it's destructive and it causes pain, and that's all we need to know, right, to make the choice that it's bad. Okay, and so war must be avoided, right? And I want to say that the ETI framework can help assist with peace efforts by trying to do a better job at understanding the sorts of cultural evolutionary dynamics that happen between groups, right? So that we can minimize the chances that war emerges, right? Because war is a cultural process. It emerges through cultural processes, right? Similarly, we can do a similar thing with racism and ethnocentrism. Probably quite likely latent aspects of our psychology that help us close ranks around people of our own type who we see to be the same, so that we can, fight other types. This is, a very challenging legacy that we have in our brains, right? Look, but the thing is that cultural diversity often accelerates innovation, right? And racism is cruel and it causes pain. It's got to be avoided. And so I just want to point out that it's important for us when we develop these kinds of theories to think directly about how they can be used for good and embed that immediately. So for example, it helps to explain how a racist dogma, which is a cultural trait, emerges to exploit an evolved legacy of discrimination or various psychological biases, right? And also how to actively counter the evolution of racist beliefs or systems, right? Because those are evolutionary things, those are cultural products which spread in society. So ethics has got to be first, right? If we're going to talk about managing human cultural evolution, who gets the right to do that? Well, you're going to have to do that ethically. Okay. So now I've added one more thing to our list. It needs to be humane, and basically it needs to be unifying if we're going to be looking at a very large scale change. We need to bring people together. So, so no pressure, right? Let's just put everything we want in one giant list and hope. But actually, we can make progress on this stuff. This is a workshop that I led in February in Leipzig with a bunch of wonderful folks, and the culmination of about a year of work. A lot of it's still ongoing. And what we worked to do, aside from building our network out, is to try to figure out how to take the science of cultural evolution and cut it at different points that could give us a little bit of idea of tools in a toolbox that may be applicable. And they are building on each other in increasing complexity: social learning, cultural adaptation, governance, and then finally some concept of transition. Excellent. I have managed to save enough time that it's all possible. Okay. We'll see. Yeah, you'll tell me at the end whether it was successful or not. So let's just take a quick, and so one of the delightful things about this workshop is we have a hired artist. And so we're building these infographics to explain each of these processes to people, both students and sort of general public. And I'm really excited about this because it's so fun to work with an artist, and it's really helpful also in a lot of ways. So we can come back to this. So taking a look at social learning, this is the basic mechanism of human cultural adaptation, human cultural evolution. Simply the idea is culture is any piece of information that spreads between us socially, right? So it's almost everything you do. And humans are believed to have a gigantic array of different types of social learning strategies where based on the environment or the age of the people around you or how successful they've been or what your state is or what you know or whether they are like you or not, all sorts of things, you decide whether or not you're going to copy what they do or learn from them, right? And so one of the important ones here is content-dependent social learning. In content-dependent social learning, you only learn based on the content or the connections Okay, I think we're back at it. Tell me, Lena, if we need to do anything.
I think the slides are not
The slides, yeah, you
The slides are I need to reshare. Okay, yep.
can sound us back.
Sound is back. Okay, marvelous. Zoom. Apologies, real humans in the actual room while I satisfy the superorganism. Okay. Yeah, see, all of a sudden it's kind of less of a joke, right? Like, ooh, that was creepy and kind of right. So apologies, people online. I know you're real humans too. Look, this study is a great one. It deals with social tipping points, and one of the key ideas with a social tipping point is, say, imagine you're playing a coordination game, and it's better for society if you're playing it so that you coordinate on the other equilibrium. Right? But this can be tricky if everyone's already driving on the left side of the road and everyone needs to drive on the right side of the road for whatever reason, right? That's the example. That's not the example here, I don't believe. But and so how do you get people to switch, right? How can you encourage behavior to do something different? What they did is they did this and then they created an intervention. I actually forget what the intervention is. It's very clever. That allows people to switch. And when the intervention is simply the intervention, it actually works quite well. You see that the alternative coordination emerges very well in this case. However, when the button you have to click on in order to coordinate happens to be very strongly representative of these basically two social identities, Biden and Trump, sitting on each other, people really, really, really don't want to touch the button, right? They will touch the button that is the one that they like, right? Because, I mean, social identity is powerful, right? So this totally stops, right? It really makes the intervention fail, okay? So what's the lesson here, right? The lesson is that human social learning, right, is a culture matters, right? The social identity matters, right? And the way in which we learn behaviors needs to not be something that is connected fundamentally to our social identity. Another example for me that is important for the environment is the rollout in the United States of the Prius, which was marketed as a green car, right? And so, nerds like me who love the environment were really excited about the Prius and go out and buy a Prius so I can have less of an environmental impact. And, a lot of other people didn't, right? It's not just that they didn't, it's that there's a strong anti-Prius sentiment in the United States, right? There are people that have bumper stickers against Priuses. There are videos online of pickup trucks that do this thing called rolling coal, where they literally have it's coal, soot, or powder that they have they have a pan, they have an injector. It can inject it into the exhaust system so they can, at the flip of a switch, spew out a huge amount of actual coal dust onto a car or a bicycle. It's called rolling coal. It's a thing that people do. This is a reaction to those social identities, right? And this is again one of the different human stories, right? And they're being in conflict with each other. So social identity matters. Let's take a look at cultural adaptation. Cultural adaptation, I have done some work to begin to study how cultural adaptation occurs in US agriculture to climate change. Now, the first thing to realize here is that crop plants are actually cultural traits, because I choose to plant corn or I choose to plant wheat or potatoes or apples or whatever. And so we can understand cultural adaptation by looking at changes in what people are planting over time relative to changing environmental conditions. And so, we use sort of standard criteria for identifying the spread of a trait that gives a context-specific benefit in a changed environment. And just to find some very simple evidence here, if you think of the change in evapotranspiration on the x-axis here, it's sort of like how dry and hot is it in a way, and then on the other side we have the change in crop evapotranspiration. This is an index based on what the crops that are planted, how they would do. So in other words, what sort of environment it looks like you are expecting to get based on the crops that you plant, right? So you could plant some crops that do very well in hot environments, right? Or you could plant crops that do well in cold environments, and farmers do a bunch of stuff, and there's a lot of change. But because we can look at what crops actually do, how well they do in different environments, you can take a given area and see what they're planting, and then you can make a pretty good guess about what the temperature should be, right? If they are, so this is a way to back out how well the crops, change in crops is matching change in environmental conditions. And overall, there's a weakly positive effect across the entire United States. And we're bolstered in our idea that this is actually a real thing, because we have 3,000 entities here, these counties, they're called, districts in the United States, and they exhibit a lot of spatial autocorrelation. This is just a very crude match. We're simply matching the signs. But the point is that there is, I think, pretty good preliminary evidence that farmers are changing the crops to match the climate. Whether or not they know or want to is a different question, right? The question is, do the crops change to grow better in the climate as it has changed, right? Answer is, yeah, overall, but also there are places where it's negative. It goes in the other direction. Now, of course, there are a lot of things that explain this, right? The price of tomatoes might have gone up, right? The subsidies that you have for planting soy might be important, which is why I look at this place right here. That this is no, this is what's below Illinois, Iowa. No, Iowa's out here. That one, that's a state. I haven't been to all of them either. So, but the point is, maybe there's a policy there that has to do with something. I don't know. Right. So this is the foundation for new analyses we're doing with at sort of a little bit higher sort of resolution by creating a continuous measure of adaptive change, and then using it to test a bunch of things that are believed from theory to be important in influencing adaptive cultural evolution, like population density. How many brains are there locally, or crop diversity, right? How likely are you to plant something new if you are surrounded by farmers who are all planting the same thing? All of the closest farmers are planting the same thing you are. That makes me a lot less likely to want to try something different, be the first person, right? But imagine you're surrounded by farmers that are planting all sorts of things. Experimentation doesn't seem so bad all of a sudden, does it? And all you've done is change what they're planting. You haven't actually changed, right? So local crop diversity, we believe will be an important one, although we haven't done the analysis. And we have a handful of other predictors we'll be looking at. So some of the lessons here is that I'll just put in a pitch for some other work by other folks here. Cultural adaptation is different than the standard old diffusion of innovations structure, because the diffusion of innovation theory, if you're familiar with it, and you need not be, can sort of be rebuilt. It focuses on innovations, but it doesn't really differentiate the idea of an innovative trade or a practice or a technology or a crop from the process of adaptation, which is a population level process, right? And so that's the added value you get by using a cultural adaptation lens. It's sort of like you start with diffusion of innovations, and then you specify the larger population system. And this allows for better predictions, which you can see in this Tversky and Gavrilet's folks' paper. Okay, now we're going to go to the next level. Remember that a huge amount of culture is group structured, right? One of the most important things we do, in fact, maybe one of the most important things we have done, is to design cooperative systems to share resources. And, you know, Elinor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize for this. And I like to point out, for these design principles right here, I like to point out that she had this frustratingly unfulfilled promise, which is this, right? Boy, when I first learned about it, I was excited to read this book, and it's still a good book. However, there's nothing about how the institutions actually evolve. So I was keen on this, and I spent a good portion of my career at the University of Maine trying to understand how institutions for, you know, natural resource management, for sustainable natural resource management evolve truly, how they emerge and become stable. And I'm going to give you an example that's based on my field research in South India, which is this place here. You can imagine there's a village on a hill, and imagine 5 villages on similar hills. And at the top, there's one shared forest, okay? That's this multi-village forest. Pretend there are no nations. There are no nations here. So all of these villages share that forest. But the forest has wood that is important for individuals to cook with and to heat their homes with. This is at relatively high elevation, so it's cold. And those individuals need that wood. So the challenge here is that the dilemma of how to preserve that wood supply is between villages. But the strong competition for the use of the wood is between individuals. So this is not a good situation for the forest, right? This sort of situation, I argue, and we'll show you more of, favors over harvesting among individuals, right? Favors individuals who are going to continue to take what they need to take, right? And not only that, they're not going to want to vote for rules within their village that say they have to take less, because the other villages aren't going to do that. And they know the other villages aren't going to do that. It's a 2-level cooperation problem, right? Now let's compare that with the alternative. And this is an important comparison case. Each of these villages has its own irrigation stream. This is also actually true. Now, if they each have their own irrigation stream, then the dilemma of how to share water is among individuals within the village, right? Which means that it's possible to design institutions and infrastructure, little water distribution channels and ponds, which they do and have, to share the water effectively. Not only that, but villages learn from each other. And that learning from each other is a kind of cultural selection. It's literally one village learning from another village. I want to select that irrigation pond idea because it allows us to hold water longer. So in this situation, we see that cultural evolution among villages or cultural selection among villages favors cooperative irrigation systems. This gives us a really nice tool to be able to distinguish what we might expect to happen when Ostrom's principles are likely to emerge, when cooperative environmental governance is likely to emerge. And so I'm going to blast through a model because no one wants to be this far into a talk and hear how I designed the model. It's an endogenous cultural group selection model, though, and that's really important for reasons I'll tell you later sometime if you want. And so we create a cultural group selection model to ask the question, how strong is this process? And in short, we have agents that are sharing a shared resource, but they also have the ability to have the idea of cooperating with other agents, right? And limiting access to the resources that they have access to from other agents. And then finally, they have social identities defined by these different, say, colors, right? So this is a tough model to deal with because the first thing that happens in every single run is that the agents proliferate and they overharvest the resources and they crash the majority of the resources. And in most of the cases, they all go extinct. But in some cases, they persist. And the reason they persist is because some group has managed to preserve its resources locally and share them among the individuals of that group. Then in the very long term, other dynamics kick in, but they remain conservationists. They continue to under-harvest the resource. This is a detail about which institutions work and how much of an effect they have on survival and therefore sustainability. And this is a complex graphic that is designed to show you that the strength of group selection for environmental conservation is the important driving factor, and it has some really interesting details that I think are probably really meaningful in time. But the point is, yes, institutions for sustainable resource use can evolve via between group cultural learning, right? Between group cultural selection, right? However you want to call that. The circumstances matter. So, and finally, that was 2017. My colleague in Leipzig has recently done this with a much fancier model, and now it's in Nature Sustainability, so you can all include this as well. But we see this in the real world as well. And here's an example from my little state of Maine, where there is a tradition of harvesting lobsters with these boats and these traps. I took a look at lobster harvesting with this economic anthropologist, Jim Atchison, and we looked at the history of lobstering over time. And part of what we find, again, is a high degree of between group competition between these gangs of lobstermen. And we see that we also find the emergence of territorial defense, of some conservation efforts, various legal strategies, various conservation practices, and actually some technology around the use of these lobsters. It's not a simple story, but it is a powerful one because we see multiple new levels of lobster industry organization emerge in these different eras. And they emerge in part because of the dynamics which have occurred in the previous era between individuals. To make it quite simple, when you first start going collecting lobsters as an individual fisherman, you go out and you collect as many as you can, and other people might be collecting them, but then you're collecting from the same area. And the ones you're competing with are the people who have boats at the harbor where your boat is. So you're competing with people who are right next to you, and you're all up in each other's faces, and it's not nice. So you form a group, and you agree not to harvest too much, not to compete with each other. In fact, you set sort of internal quotas. This is all totally unofficial, right? And moreover, your group can now expand. You can take turns and you can patrol the territory. They get into fights. There are people who died over lobster stuff. They burned their boats, and there was killing, and it was very intense. But the point is, we see this emergence of internal cooperation and institutions to manage the resource as a result of these pressures, right? So it's another example. We can even see a similar thing happen with the emergence of cooperative governance inside cooperative stores. These are businesses, cooperative businesses. This is the first example in the English language where we have a cooperative business that wrote down its business principles. And the modern version of those business principles are here. They're called the cooperative principles. Well, they're really similar to Ostrom's principles. They're actually really, really similar. And there are a few that don't align. But we think this is probably some type of convergent evolution because they're doing the same thing. They're basically sets of principles that are designed to ensure that cooperation happens between the members of the group. So over the periods from 1860 to 2000, these principles have changed and merged, and some have been added and some have been deleted, and they've spread. And we have, we think, good evidence, or we have some evidence that is perhaps suggestive that there have been a number of situations where these principles have helped cooperatives survive in their local social and economic environment. If you want to talk more about the evolution of cooperatives, I would love to do that because I have spent a lot of time on it. But the institutions of cooperative governance may be adaptive and certainly evolve culturally. So finally, we get to the most applied example, again from my colleagues Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder and Jeff Andrews at Leipzig. This is Pemba Island off of Tanzania, and is broken into a series of districts. This island was identified by the UN Red Plus program to receive carbon payments for preserving their forests. Now, individuals get money by selling the wood they harvest from their village forests to lumber traders because it's tropical hardwood, it's worth a lot of money. And so the idea is if we pay people, they will be able to use that money locally and offset this. In order to do that, they had to start various sets of practices in order to be able to start receiving the payments. They had to start village level practices to protect the forest from harvesting. And these are the ones that began that process. So what's interesting here is that this is an intervention, and it's a group level intervention among a population of groups. So the potential to develop institutions is right there. In fact, it's intentional, it's built in, right? And a number of them do. And what you see when they do is the ones that develop institutions often start harvesting wood from other ones who haven't developed the forest guards yet. Well, we can't harvest from our village, so we'll harvest from the other ones. And that, fascinatingly, created a competition mechanism that made it more likely that some of the other villages started to protect their forests as well. Right. So we see, again, a between group interaction being important in changes that led to the emergence of institutions. This is a sad story because the California-based, what's it called, Terra Global Capital never paid. And so these groups are without the payment, which is just absolutely brutal. So that whole system, that whole payment for ecosystem services system is falling apart. And if I had Monique here, she's very unhappy about all this. So moving on, what's the lesson? The lesson is that conservation policy is a group level cultural trait, right? And I'm talking about the policy and the institutions within the village, right? And it emerges by cultural evolution between those villages, right? Not only that, but between group learning of what other groups are doing and how we can use it to protect our resources is an important way to spread the cooperation and to manage the environment better. So this is an application lever. In case it hasn't been obvious, in this effort to build an applied science, we don't have the applied science yet, right? I'm trying to make the case that we have this applied science. And now finally we get to the craziest one of all. This is transition. This is an aspirational one. We've gone from simple social learning to cultural adaptation to group level cultural adaptation. And now we're going to try to throw the whole thing in. Why do I have this here? Well, in the sustainability and resilience world, we often think about transitions for sustainability. So what does a sustainability transition look like? Well, it's often poorly imagined, and we certainly don't know how to get there in most cases, right? It's aspirational, but it is a systemic or holistic change in the way society works. In particular, changes in the relationships between people and society, between people and nature. So it's this kind of thing, as the social scientists were talking about, a cultural evolutionary transition where we create new levels of social structure. Again, it may have happened with cooperative hunting. It may have happened with agriculture. Agriculture certainly created more complex hierarchical societies. Fossil fuels is yet another example. So maybe there's another thing here. Maybe living renewably could itself be understood as a sort of cultural transition in individuality where people get together in groups in order to live differently with the environment, right? That's not so crazy. Now, this is aspirational, right? So, but I'm going to just give you a little piece that will finish us off. You've seen this first ratchet here. This is the feedback of the evolutionary transition, which I propose describes our entire species. Now, I want to add another feedback to it, which is about the intensity and scale of environmental modification and the fitness value of the extracted material and energy that we use, right? We've been doing this for a long time. Our groups get more capable, and so we extract more from the environment, and then those groups do better, and so they proliferate and they grow, and then we find new resources and they get more energy and resources, and so they grow and they get bigger and they proliferate, and that allows them to get more intense and to design new methods of resource extraction. You know the story, right? This explains, this process here explains our exponential takeover of the environment. It's an evolutionary ratchet of environmental control and impact. So we take a look at the human ecological niche over time. This is a simple story here, and you know it, and so I'll cut to the chase. Part of what we see is the expansion of the human niche is connected to group level cultural traits for environmental control of different types. One type is environmental extraction, right? We extract resources and energy. Those tend to come first. So imagine agriculture or pollution. Pollution being, a type of capacity that we use, right? And then the management and protection of those group level protection and management traits emerge sometimes, but they emerge later, only after we have despoiled the resource, only after we have used too much of the fish, only after we've cut down the forest and we realized, whoops, we can cut down the forest. We hadn't thought of it before, right? The word for sustainability comes from German, and my understanding is the word comes from German foresting technology or practice, and it came after, literally, we over-harvested the forest. Right, the Clean Air and Clean Water Act in the United States didn't come around when everything was crystal clear, right? They came after we really messed things up. So we can take the spatial scale of an environmental resource and the spatial scale that you need to control in order to be able to manage that resource and compare it with the intensity of cooperation that we have in society, okay? And this creates this state space of human groups in the Anthropocene. And then within this space, we have these isoclines, these lines that represent, if you're above this area, you might have a resource which requires a certain level of cooperation at a certain scale, right? And human groups, and so of course, there we go. And so, and there are different ones that require different levels of cooperation. So for example, at the scale of the globe, global sustainability is possible, truly, but maybe only if we actually agree to not just keep having kids forever, right? Because that won't work. So at some level, that is relevant here. That's an interesting thing because reproduction, you remember, goes way back to the beginning of the talk. So these are our global sustainability frontiers, and the first one here is climate change. So Importantly, global sustainability requires global environmental control traits. In fact, laws and technical systems and social processes to manage a complex biosphere. Right? Probably one of the most complex things we've ever done. Historical and prehistorical human societies have been getting larger and cooperating ever more intensely. And so being able to control larger and larger scale environmental resources. And now we are bumping up against the climate change frontier, right? Typically, environmental control traits are coming in increasing scales, and it's the environmental exploitation traits that are the cause of the Anthropocene, right? So now the question is, do we solve the climate change problem by cooperating at a higher level, and importantly, having a higher degree, a higher spatial scale of environmental control? We do not have any global control over the environment today. Or do we fail to? And if we fail to, then that means we may end up competing with each other more, right? And that's a bad thing. We don't want to compete with each other more. If we did, we might, harm the biosphere enough that we cause a major collapse in human population. I don't need to explain these right now. But just to say, in the upper left-hand corner, that's a bad place to go, right? We don't want to be in the place where competition between groups over the environment is leading to direct conflict between groups, because that's what that is, right? The number of groups is going down as competition is getting higher. This leads us to a fundamental problem that we are facing. That if you thought climate change was bad, I'm sorry to ruin your day. The population structure problem of the human ETII is based on these 4 ideas. The first is that human evolution is driven by group level cultural evolution in the very long term. The second is that global sustainability requires global cultural traits, that's technical systems, legal systems, social systems, to manage the environment. Those in turn need a social entity like a society to be able to express them. And naturally, those traits lag behind the scale of society, but we have a population of subglobal societies, right? We have a population of subglobal groups. We have a population of nations. They are not capable of expressing a global scale trait. And the problem is deeper than that, right? It's that when do these things emerge? When do traits emerge? Traits emerge at a scale best when you have an entire population of groups, right? And they're learning from each other. So they can learn how to manage their resources like the folks in Pemba did by seeing the fact that I'm stealing from your forest. And so you stop allowing me to come into your forest, right? And so that's how we are best equipped to develop environmental control practices. The problem is we need to do that at the level of the planet. But we don't even have a single individual at the level of the planet. We have a bunch of sub-global groups. So we do not know, even in theory, if a population of humans can persist indefinitely on a planet. We simply are solving the wrong adaptive problem. Okay, now we'll come back to climate change and it'll be much friendlier, okay? So solving
Probably not for your Mac, right?
I didn't bring one. I
Yeah,
think there's probably one here. Anyway, I should have thought of
it's
that.
they usually try and hardwire him because it's
Smart. Thank you. Sorry I didn't do this.
I was looking earlier and I didn't think you had one on your laptop, so I didn't.
No, not a basic. Yeah, but there is a, Mac dongle. Speaking of. Okay, nope. Okay, we're back on here, and now we. Oh no, I have to go to Zoom. Share. Screen. And back. Apologies, everyone. I know the room is a little too warm, a little too comfortable. Yeah, okay. All good, Lena. But what this suggests to someone thinking in evolutionary terms is that there's probably a selection process going on here as well, right? So this is not strong evidence that there's a selection process, but what's the easiest way to do better or produce more as a company? Spend more energy, right? And the cheapest way to get energy is fossil fuels. And these are the Fortune 500 companies. These are some of the most wealthy corporations in the world. And so it's probably not just that spending fossil fuels is adaptive. It's that that companies are looking at each other to see how to spend energy more effectively to do better. The same thing, of course, is true with nations, right? Quality of life is directly tied. That's not true. Quality of life is complexly tied to energy expenditure, but tied nonetheless, and fossil fuels remains one of the cheapest ways to expend energy. So, but this is okay because it gives us a way to articulate what we need to do. We need to change group level cultural evolution. We need to change the direction of selection operating on corporations and nations relative to their fossil fuel use. Okay, that's not as positive as it might have, as I might have promised. Here's a better one. Solar cell technology has also evolved between group learning, right? This is the history of solar cell technology. It's really fascinating and amazing. All sorts of different laboratories and companies developing different chemistries. And it's fantastic. And of course, they're racing, and we know what they're racing on is how efficient can your solar cells get. It's a wonderful story, and thankfully we're benefiting from it. So cultural group selection can create good things too, I promise. Okay, so we're at the end, and I've taken enough of your afternoon, and I'm eager to talk about all of this with you. I've just sketched the possibility of a crazy new theory to incorporate the whole scale of the Anthropocene and our species. I think it actually gets kind of partway down the line of fulfilling all those desiderata. Although I'd like to hear otherwise, and I'd like to talk about it. But then I think we need to push ahead and make some applied progress. And so we need to be asking these kinds of questions, right? We need to figure out how we can create global cooperative environmental governance in the distinct lack of between group pressure for it, because that's how we've done it in the past. And I think we often operate under the assumption that, well, we'll just solve this like we do usually. Yeah, maybe we can, but we should certainly be working on that problem. And I think there are a whole bunch of applied methods that we need to start using as well. But that's my pitch for an applied cultural evolution science to solve sustainability problems or to help address sustainability problems. And I want to give a call for help to you all, right? We need more minds. We need better minds. We need better basic science. We need better models. We need better data. We need more application. We need global scale cooperation. We need global scale funding. All of these things. So please help if any of these are useful. Please join me, or please take this and run and do better. Thank you. Apologies for taking so long. We still have time for talking. Here we go. Yes. First, questions or thoughts from the room? Or comments? Might even.
Yeah, so fascinating. So there's way more to mentally process there than I can deal with at the moment. But
That's fine.
Time to talk.
That's fine. Yeah.
Starting with a clarification on the major evolutionary transitions.
Yes.
So going all the way back to Maynard Smith and Swarthmore, I see
Yes.
Swarthmore, so I'm assuming you know a lot more about this than I do. I'm going back in time in my memory of reading this by a long time. So
No problem. I love that you've read it.
So originally it was proposed as different organisms evolving. So basically obligate mutualism. So an obligate mutualism forms and they function as one organism. And wasn't it later that the kind of superorganism, eusocial evolution arguments kind of got integrated into it all?
The major evolutionary transitions framework had both, and it wasn't really sort of distinguished. It was sort of like the emergence of sex was also a major evolutionary transition. And so nowadays, for the evolutionary transitions and individuality sort of definition, which I think is, I prefer because it's sort of sharper. There are a number of different ways of sort of categorizing them. One of them is sort of fraternal transitions, right? You have a bunch of organisms of the same species, right? And they can associate, and sort of that's the route to, multicellularity, or to becoming, eusocial, social insect superorganism. And then you have the egalitarian transitions, which are like these mutualisms or the endosymbiosis. And so
I always thought about those as integrated later on, but originally two separate lines of thought.
it was sort of the other way around. They sort of lumped them all together as a, I think, method of convenience in the first, in 95.
Okay.
And people have started slicing more finely since, thankfully, because it was too much. But the point is, yes, these are different things.
Okay. Anyway, obviously the reason I ask is for humans, because obviously both can apply to humans, but you get a very different kind of starting point or way to play out the theory, depending on which version of those. With different organisms, it's domestication
Exactly
is the key versus obviously non-kin based social behavior, I guess would be the other one.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you might just say that, with conspecifics, we can form a group, right? We could form a society now if we were cut off, from the rest of society, and maybe we'd survive. And if we did, we'd invent, social organization and ways of getting resources and protecting ourselves. And so I think in a way, it doesn't even need to be kin, right? Because that's genetic relatedness. But yes, I think your point is exactly right. And I would love to talk more specifically with you.
But if it is kin, then you can't eliminate all the other selection levels. I mean, you could go back to Dawkins then, and then so you have to, in theory, say it's not a social system that is not kin based.
Yeah, I mean, well, indeed. I mean, that's what we have, right? We have one that has moved. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I'd love to talk more specifically about the domesticates and.
That's obviously what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Shall I take one from online? Carlton.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Maybe see me. Okay. So I have so many questions. That was a great talk. Thank you. But I have two that I'll get across quickly. So one thing that I've struggled with forever, thinking about cultural selection and cultural evolution, is how we can draw this bright line around groups and distinguish something like group selection, like groups competing and then somehow reproducing themselves in some sense, from groups as epiphenomena of simply individual level selection, whereby the group is just a trait that an individual has, and it's a proxy for like a package of traits and behaviors. And in cultural cases, moving around between groups is possible. So the groups aren't actually being selected, it's still individual level selection in some sense, maybe. So like, what is the necessity for the group selection, and do we need it for the math to work out?
Yes, that's marvelous. That's a great question, and it's very insightful to be able to dive all the way into it. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's not just an accounting thing. I think there really are strong between group processes that determine group level outcomes, and those group level outcomes are filtered through the effectiveness of the institutions, right, and the technology and infrastructure that those groups have, right, and so there really are strong group level effects. But your point about, well, how do I think about cultural change, right, which is stored in the brains of individuals, right, as being a group level phenomenon? I think sort of phenomenologically, there are sort of two categories, right? One is most of the culture that we're used to is the culture that we have in our brains because we use it to operate our mouths and everything else, right? It's individual level traits. Now, those traits are shared in groups, right? So everyone in this room speaks English, so they've been nice to be able to listen to me here, and so we share those traits. But speaking English is not a group level trait, right? It's a trait of me. I speak English. I could go away by myself and I'd still speak English, and so could all of us, as well as other languages.
Well, anyone could choose to as well. So even if you're in some other country, someone could just choose to learn English and speak English. So that
right. Yes. So that's a distributional situation, right? So you can get group level, correlations of those individual level traits, and that is sufficient by itself to create group selective processes. So in that endogenous cultural group selection model, which I didn't show you, what we do is we have no group structure embedded in the model. Everything that's in the model is individual level traits, and yet group processes emerge. And this is really important because previously other models would build in group level, competition or death or birth mechanisms, which it kind of gets you group selection you assume that it's there. And so if you assume that it's there, then it's going to happen. That's not the same thing as measuring how strong it is. And so what I do is I measure how strong it is, right? And so that's an important component. In that model, individual agents they copy the traits of other individuals, and they copy things including their harvesting preference and their institutional sort of beliefs or ideas, and their social identity, possibly. And so what that means is that makes it possible for individual traits to support a group. Now, the group has squishy boundaries because you could be in the group and you could decide to change allegiances, right? And it happens all the time in my models because the groups come and go. But this is really important, and it's a really important demonstration of exactly your question in terms of can you have this cultural group selection be useful or relevant just with individual traits? The answer is emphatically yes. But also, in addition, there is another type of cultural trait which I think is really important, and I took it in order to get here from Jena, like the train. The train is a group level infrastructure trait, right? It's created by cultural processes and institutions, and it's maintained by them, right? It's not a biological phenomenon in a sense, right? So infrastructure generally is a great example of it, but also institutions, right? I can want to be democratic, but it doesn't matter how I feel. In terms of myself, I'm either my own king or my own perfect democracy or whatever. There's no thing, I'm not instead, democracy is a trait of a group. The group is either a democratic group with the institutions that support democracy, or it is not, right?
That's sort of density dependent. So it seems to me like a lot of it is, it's individual level traits and behaviors. There's spatial autocorrelation and stuff like density dependence going on, and maybe some kind of green beard thing. And there's kin selection, and then from that emerges groups. And you can see the groups as an emergent property, which makes them kind of epiphenomenal. So it's not like saying that there's groups, they're competing with one another, and one group somehow asexually reproduces and spawns two other groups that are identical to it, and that's how we're measuring whether a group is successful or not based on how many granddaughter groups it has. Instead, you're measuring it another way, and it's this more bottom-up generative emergent phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah, we use the price equation to decompose the evolutionary dynamics in the paper. And I'd be happy to show you that, but that's a really robust way to do it. And I think the thing though is to think about those sorts of processes happening with individual level culture deep in the past. And now we live in a world where, we very much have group level traits, right? Does this group have whatever kind of technology installed? Yes, no, right? Do we have a rule against X or Y here? Yes, no. Like, am I going to get arrested right here if I do this? No, I'm not, because the rule isn't there. And so now we live in a world where group level cultural traits, take on really physical form. So those are great questions. Thank you so much.
There's one comment that I would have then too, which I guess leads into a related question.
I'll lead into another. Go ahead.
Yeah, the reproduction thing. So because later on, this has implications for the policy side of things. You were saying that, so we might need, and reproduction is an example, there's too many people on the planet, so maybe do we need some higher level, higher order of cooperation in order to reduce that? But then my counter would be, well, we've already seen massive drop-offs in reproductive rate in lots of countries around the world, and there's been no higher level coordination in order to do that. That's like an effect of individuals making choices in a particular context. So the group is there, the group stuff is happening, but you don't need top-down coordination to do it. These are just individuals responding to their local environment. The local environment is just defined by the behavior of other people around them, which is like a long-winded way of saying a group.
Yep. Yes, and I'm going to punt on that and not expound. But I want to thank you, Carlton. Those are excellent questions. And let's see. Why don't I see if anyone else wants to? Anyone's here still?
I guess I had a kind of follow up to that. Is this idea? You were saying it's a big problem that until we get the global decision making body, we can't necessarily solve these problems. But again, there are certain things that have a global reach that will still affect the regional bodies at present, right? So they can still be influenced, and even perhaps that competition, as long as it doesn't get violent, as you mentioned ethically, could still actually then drive overall a globally great solution if each region was adapted to its region. Does it necessarily, I suppose my question is, have to be, you end up with a UN of the world, right? I guess would be, or actually are some of these things actually possible, maintaining different levels of organization?
I don't know. I mean, that's the easy answer, right? And I think, it's possible that we can figure out, I mean, no matter how we slice it, managing the biosphere and managing the climate as our first test is going to require, global scale coordination, right? And so that's cooperative governance to some degree. Even if we're all just separate nations and we all just agree to do the thing, then we can all just agree to be cooperative, and that'd be great, right? It's like, okay, everyone, be good. And so, but the challenge is, what if when people don't want to be good, or, developing nations say, hey, you guys got to eat all of the cake and we're just showing up now. This seems unfair. So, I mean, we're intelligent too. So it's possible that we may be able to do this, right? And I don't want to, sound hopeless, but it's just that, when you look at it as an evolutionary process, we usually evolve traits, and this is true of just organisms generally, evolving genetically as well as us. We usually evolve traits once we've developed a group that has some coherence, like and an identity, right? And right now our identities are sub-global, our nations, our corporations, and so it seems like we should actually think about that and maybe even try to address it, right? Can we think about ourselves in a global sense? Can we facilitate the emergence of a global identity so that we're more collectively willing to do that? Interesting idea.
Follow up on this, just.
Yes, please.
So don't you have some kind of outline how to do it in your talk when you have this picture with the multi-level decision structure, and where you have the decision-making entity and where you have the social dilemma? And couldn't you maybe do some research on how to make rules from this for on which level you have to put the decision-making in order to have the social dilemma on the right level to
Yes.
solve it?
The problem, if you remember though, is that the social dilemma is at the top. But the social dilemma is, I can pull up the figure. The bad situation is when the social dilemma is above the level of most active adaptation, is above the dominant level of selection.
But you also had one of the pictures where it was then below. So
Yeah, that's when we had multiple villages and each village has its own environment to manage.
But maybe
We
this
need
could
multiple
give me-
planets, each with its own environment to manage, you see?
I think.
That's the
Mhm.
problem. Now, this doesn't mean it's not possible, but it does mean it really is a problem from that perspective. And I think it's a useful way to think about this problem, because it's not just that, solving climate change may be the hardest thing we've ever done. It may be of a type of things that we haven't done too. Or maybe it may be not the way adaptation at groups tends to work, right? So what's the challenge of building cooperative governance, right? The challenge is cooperating. It's the same challenge, and so I think that climate change is a particularly good starting place, right? Because climate change is strong, it's in our faces, it's changing our experience in the world now on a daily and yearly basis. We're seeing its impacts, so it's quite apparent. And I think a bunch of the other ones that are coming are not so obvious. Things like ecosystem, process simplification, right? Loss of biodiversity, leading to tipping points that we don't know where they are, that are really close. Even local pollution at a global scale. Well, everyone just feels like it's their own local pollution, because it is, but we're doing it everywhere all at the same time, right? That's also a tipping point that you don't see until it's too late. Right. So I think climate change is usefully painful in that way. Do we have a question from online? Yes, Gopesh.
Thanks, Tim. Can you hear me properly? Is it fine?
Yes.
Just a curiosity about one thing regarding the theoretical aspect of it, talking about genetic evolution and cultural evolution, and talking about the third stage you say is like the culture element overpowering and kind of taking over the genetic part. Now it reminds me of, as a human evolution enthusiast, like we talk about survival of the fittest, and recently we started talking about survival of the friendliest. But as a components, if you see the pace of these components and way they work are quite different. The way the culture works is quite hyperdynamic, and where the genotypic and phenotypic part works, it's quite different. When we think in theoretical premises, that's one taking over another one, how do we understand that? Because we don't know in a million of years how things may look like, probably the past or in the future context.
Yeah, right. Yes, right. That's a big question you've given me. And I could go into sort of more detail, right? It's a hypothesis, and you should read my papers. They're open access on my website. But in a quick summary, the idea is that we continue to accumulate group level cultural adaptations that make our lives more and more effective, successful, what have you, right? And that our culture, the knowledge in our brains, as well as the institutions and technology and infrastructure that we're surrounded with in our cultural groups, matters more and more and more for our long-term outcomes, right, in an increasing way. And so it's not that genes need to go away. In fact, biologists, evolutionary biologists, believe that in studying the evolution of life on Earth in the very early phases, it's quite likely that RNA was a primary replicator before DNA became as important as it is today. And in fact, DNA emerged later, and one hypothesis says it's only because DNA is a better long-term storage mechanism and it's less prone to errors when it's getting copied, that DNA became more important in the long term. Now, it's not that RNA went away. It's just that RNA, talks to the DNA and then talks to the protein. So it's in the sort of chain of command. It's a part of the sort of phenotype, if you want to think about it that way. So you might think about human genes in that way, right? In the future. So for example, of course, we're already genetically modifying many other species, crop species and what have you. We have a genetically modified pig that gave someone a liver, I think it was recently, brand new news. And we do this in order to, make the crops grow the way we want. Now, it's worth thinking about that process of genetic change, right? In the case of flavor saver tomatoes, my understanding is the gene actually comes from an antifreeze protein in fish that you put into tomatoes in order to make them to be able to, live further into cold temperatures without going bad. I think that's flavor saver. I can't remember. There's one of the, anyway, genetically modified organisms only have genes in them, but those genes were moved by a process of cultural transmission, right? It was culture that moved the genes, right? We're managing the gene. So you could imagine this sort of thing also occurring, of course, for humans, what have you. There are many sort of, speculative ways to think about these processes. I think the important part is to, for the here and now, is to think about the importance of cultural groups on sort of individual and environmental life outcomes. Thank you very much.
But just a curiosity, if I may continue a bit about it. Just for example, of cases of Tibetan populations. So there was a paper out about EPAS1, which basically is a result of gene that came from Denisovan Homo sapien integration happened in that population. Thus, Tibetan populations are able to prevent high altitude hypoxia. The fact it is, even after integration, modern humans as we survived and Denisovans got extinct. So how do we perceive, even analyze such scenarios if you're talking about the coevolution in deep time context?
That's a specific case. And it seems like that's a question that you should shoot me an email on, Gopesh, if that's all right.
Sure,
Yeah.
For sure. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the room? It's the afternoon, I think.
I just want to, on your very last slide, it's to say the notion of nation state and that your program would be to kind of optimize for solutions for nation states. But there could also be an argument that with the rise of communication technologies, nation states are not so important anymore. And you have something like global societies, which are virtual. So they're like non-local and thereby created, again, a different type of dynamics of cultural adaptation.
Right.
And that could be like another kind of phase transition in your framework, kind of.
And I think that's exactly right. I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to really crystallize, right? Of course, those global communication networks are, made legal and illegal and censored and not censored based on, the whims of nations. They're also enabled or spied on based on the whims of the companies that run them. But yes, of course, new modes of information transmission are the ways that we often make these changes. And so perhaps there is some avenue there, right, by which we might be able to grow global connectedness to some degree of some use. I think that's a really good insight. Yeah.
I can also ask you.
One more, yeah. You all are welcome to throw crazy questions at me. I just spent an hour and a half throwing crazy ideas at you. Yeah.
Is there another question? Should I wait later?
And then-
Here all day tomorrow.
Yeah, I can chat with any and all of you. I don't have to keep you all captive.
Wait.
So I'll try to keep it somewhat quick, but
Sure.
the inheritance theory, because I'm really enjoying all the evolutionary theory that you're diving into here.
Oh, thank you.
So you referenced it starting as a concept with the Feldman, Lawler, and O'Brien in 2004. Like that's all great. In the same year, niche construction theory by the same three scholars is presented in two separate papers, and eventually they
Created some of the species typical traits we take for granted. And so, yes, there may be signatures we can see now in more modern populations where we may actually see between population differences. And so that's possible. My understanding, first of all, is that I don't know how much work is going on at the moment. How many people are looking for such things? There's some, for sure. And so short answer is, I don't know the answer to that. But also, if we're in stage 3, then, genetic evolution is being put into neutral, right? And it's cultural change, which is making the difference. And so, the places where we should be looking is also in the past, where small genetic changes that lead to changes in, brain function that allow us to, be able to, stare at each other and interpret what I'm saying up here. I mean, this is an incredible effort that you guys have done. And it's easy, right? You've just been sitting there, but you have these supercomputers mounted on your shoulders that have taken in all of this and interpreted it. And, that's just not possible without this stuff, right? Wherever
and that wouldn't go back to E.O. Wilson's on the leash.
Yeah, well, I mean, right, and that contrasts with that concept of it's on a leash, right? Instead, it's like, oh, we open up this little ability to learn socially, and then whoa, those individuals keep, doing, and then more and more, and then all of a sudden, most of humanity can learn socially most of their lifetime. A sort of unending series of things, multiple languages, it's insane, right? So yeah.
And I think we should thank Tim again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Yay, thank you, folks online. I'm going to let you free into cyberspace. Be at peace. I will try to